They say money talks, but in the heart of the city, in the real, breathing, sweat-soaked, glorious heart of it, silence is the ultimate luxury. Stand on Victoria Island at the right hour, when the morning haze hasn't yet burned off the lagoon, and you will see two Lagoses existing in the same breath. One Lagos screams past in a blur of carbon fiber and imported leather, tinted windows keeping the world at a comfortable distance. The other Lagos wakes before sunrise, ties a wrapper around its waist, and builds the day from scratch with bare hands and stubborn faith. Most people never see both in the same frame. Most people never have to. But on one particular Tuesday morning in the third week of March, both worlds collided on a stretch of road near Amara Bello Way, and neither would ever be the same again. Meet Amara. Her full name was Amara Chidinma Okafor, though the people who loved her, and there had been many once, called her simply Chi. She was 53 years old, though she looked older in her hands and younger in her eyes, which is the particular arithmetic of women who have carried enormous grief with enormous grace. She was not tall, she was not imposing, standing at her roadside stall in the honey-thick morning heat, with her faded indigo head wrap and her worn soft blouse the color of river clay, she could disappear into the scenery of a city that had long since noticed her. Her stall was nothing remarkable. A wooden frame she'd built herself from reclaimed timber, a corrugated zinc roof that groaned in the wind, a display of oranges, plantains, garden eggs, and small paper bags of ground crayfish arranged with a care that was almost architectural. She had a kitchen scale, dented on one side. She had a dog-eared receipt book. She had a small plastic stool she never sat on because there was always something to do, always something to arrange or wipe or restack. And she had a purse, a tattered leather purse, brown gone nearly black with years of handling, its brass clasp replaced twice and now held together with a small safety pin. Inside that purse, on that particular Tuesday morning, was the whole sum of Amara's material world. 450 naira in coins, a small folded prayer she had written herself on the back of a church bulletin 8 years ago and never unfolded since. A photograph, creased down the middle of a young man laughing at something outside the frame, and the naira equivalent of 112 American dollars, kept not in one place, but in 3, some in the main pocket, some tucked in the small zipper compartment, and some folded so flat it looked like a receipt. $112. In the world of Julian Vance, $112 was the cost of a glass of wine he didn't finish. It was the tip he left, or didn't leave, depending on his mood. It was the rounding error on a rounding error in an investment portfolio so large it required its own dedicated team of analysts to monitor around the clock. Julian Amadeus Vance. The name itself had been engineered, though not by him, by his father, Reginald Vance, a South African-born commodity trader who moved to London, then to New York, then to wherever the money was richest that particular decade. By the time Julian was 30, he had tripled his inheritance. By 35, he had acquired 4 companies, 2 of which he'd turned around from near bankruptcy through a combination of brutal efficiency and near sociopathic focus. By 40, his name appeared regularly in the kind of publications that existed solely to catalog the movements and opinions of the extremely wealthy. He was photographed at charity galas he attended without donating. He was quoted in business magazines saying things that sounded profound and were, on reflection, simply expensive. He was, on the morning in question, 48 years old, freshly arrived in Lagos for a 48-hour trip to assess the viability of acquiring a majority stake in a West African telecoms infrastructure company. He was staying at the Echo Hotel in a suite whose nightly rate was more than Amara made in 6 months. He had arrived the previous evening on a private jet, A Gulfstream G700 if anyone was keeping score, and several people always were. And ate dinner alone in his suite while reviewing financial projections on a tablet propped against a silver wine cooler. He had rented the Pagani Huayra because he always rented something extraordinary wherever he went. It was not ostentation, he would have told you, it was preference. He appreciated engineering. He appreciated the particular music of a 12-cylinder engine at full song, the way a machine built to its absolute limit felt alive under your hands in a way that nothing bought at the softer end of the market ever quite did. The Pagani Huayra he was driving that morning was matte black with copper accents on the intake vents and the door handles. It was worth approximately $2 million. It had been delivered to the hotel at 7 a.m. by a logistics company that specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement for exactly this kind of man. He had driven it out of the hotel's underground car park at 8:43, turned left into the city, and within 12 minutes had left the groomed boulevards of Victoria Island behind and found himself on a road he had not expected. Busier, narrower, shimmering with the heat that was already building despite the hour, lined on both sides with the organized chaos of morning trade. He should have turned back. He knew this area wasn't on his planned route. His driver, yes, he had a driver, but he dismissed the man for the morning because he wanted to drive himself, because controlling the machine was the point, had given him a different set of directions. He deviated because a section of the planned road was blocked by a water tanker and two arguing men, and he'd made a snap decision to cut through. Snap decisions. It would come to seem, later, like the universe had been waiting patiently for him to make exactly this one. The dog was a small reddish-brown mongrel that lived in the area and was known locally as Biscuit, though Julian did not know this and would not have cared if he did. Biscuit had survived 5 years on these streets through a combination of speed, cunning, and an apparently supernatural awareness of moving vehicles. On this particular morning, for reasons that will never be fully understood, Biscuit chose to cross the road at the exact moment the Pagani was passing at a speed considerably above what the road could safely absorb. Julian saw the dog. He reacted as he always did, immediately, decisively, without the half-second of paralysis that costs most people their options. He turned the wheel hard. The rear tires, low profile and designed for racing circuits rather than the suddenly potholed texture of a Lego side road, lost their purchase on the sun-warmed tarmac. The car's tail stepped out. The computer systems did their best, which was considerable but not infinite. The car corrected partially, swung, and then, with a kind of slow-motion inevitability that witnesses would describe for weeks afterward, plowed sideways into Amara's stall. The sound was enormous. Oranges became projectiles, a bunch of ripe plantains which Amara had arranged at the front of the display because their yellow-black skin was beautiful and drew the eye, exploded in a spray of soft pulp. The wooden frame of the stall, which Amara and her late neighbor's son had taken an entire Sunday to construct 7 years ago, did not splinter gradually, but seemed to simply cease to exist, reduced to component parts in an instant. The zinc roof sailed a short distance and landed on the road with the sound like a dropped tray in an empty hall. The kitchen scale vanished entirely and would be found 2 days later, 30 meters away, lodged in the branches of a neem tree. The Pagani's matte black door, the one facing the stall, was destroyed. The carbon fiber, which was engineered to be simultaneously light and extraordinarily rigid but was not designed to absorb the corner of a wooden market stall at that angle, tore and crumpled in ways that would make the repair specialist who later examined it physically wince. The copper accent trim was gone entirely. The front wing was buckled. The airbag had deployed. Julian stepped out of the car. He was unhurt, shaken in the way that the body registers sudden violence before the mind catches up, but physically without injury. He stood in the wreckage of Amara's stall, amid the scattered fruit, the broken timber, the drifting receipt papers and spilled crayfish, and he looked at his car. and the expression on his face, which the gathering crowd would later try to describe in various ways, was not concern for the woman who stood a few feet away covered in the dust his car had raised. It was the expression of a man calculating loss and being angry at the number. Julian Vance was 6 feet 2 inches tall. In his perfectly cut cream linen suit, Brioni, made to measure, chosen because it said, "I am rich enough to wear light colors in a city," he was the physical embodiment of an idea. The idea that the world was divided into people things happened to and people who made things happen, and that he was definitively the latter. He looked at the car. He looked at the stall. Then, finally, he looked at Amara. She was still standing. This seemed to surprise him at some level, as though he had half expected her to already be prostrate, already apologizing, already positioned in the supplicant posture he unconsciously expected from people on this side of the economic divide. Instead, she stood with her arms slightly away from her body, the way a person stands when they are choosing deliberately not to fold. There was dust in her head wrap. Her blouse had a streak of orange pulp across the left shoulder. She was looking at him with eyes that did not flinch. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides. The crowd was already forming. It moved in the way Lagos crowds always move. Not slowly, not in a rush, but with the quiet efficiency of people who understand that the street is a theater and that what is unfolding here is worth watching. A man selling phone credit stopped mid-transaction. 2 schoolchildren in white and navy uniforms pressed to the edge of the scene. A woman with a tray of chin-chin balanced on her head set the tray down on a nearby wall. 3 motorcyclists pulled over simultaneously, as if choreographed. Julian's voice, when he spoke, was low. He had learned long ago that volume was a sign of desperation, that the truly powerful didn't need to shout. He spoke in the register of absolute, unquestioned authority, the tone of a man who had never once in his adult life been made to wait, to explain himself, to account for anything. "Do you have any idea," he said, "how many lifetimes you would have to work to pay for a single bolt on this car?" He gestured behind him. The Pagani, even in its devastated state, glittered in the morning sun with the obscene beauty of extreme money. Carbon fiber catching light, copper trim winking, a machine built to the absolute edge of human engineering capability, now wearing Amara's roadside stall across its face. "This car," he said, "costs more than everything in this street combined, more than this block. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? This isn't about money that can be paid back. This is money that doesn't exist in your world." Amara said nothing. This was not shock. It was not the silence of a woman who had been struck dumb by wealth or authority, or the towering physical fact of Julian Vance standing close enough that she could smell the bergamot and cedar of his cologne, mixing with the petrol and dust smell of the ruined morning. It was a different kind of silence altogether, chosen, intentional, the silence of someone who was listening to something more than the words being spoken. She was listening to the shape of the man in front of her. She had seen men like Julian before. Not this rich, perhaps. Lagos had many varieties of wealthy, but Julian Vance was a specific subspecies, the kind of rich that comes from a place so far removed from ordinary experience that it no longer even recognizes ordinary experience as real. She had seen the particular anger of such men, the way it was always personal, always about an offense to the self, never about the actual event. His car was damaged. To him, this meant he had been damaged. His power had been interrupted. The inconvenience was cosmic in its scale, in his telling. She understood all of this in about 4 seconds. The crowd behind him had grown. A man in a yellow agbada had materialized from somewhere and was filming with his phone. 2 young men with the lean, watchful look of the street were moving slightly to flank the scene, not threateningly, but in the way of people who understand that crowds have physics and who are positioning themselves for whatever those physics might require. An older woman near the back had her hands pressed together, and whether she was praying or simply waiting was difficult to tell. Julian reached out. He intended to take Amara's arm, not violently, he would have said, not aggressively, simply to establish the physical reality of the situation, to create the kind of contact that means pay attention, I am speaking to you. But the gesture, in the crowd's reading of it, looked exactly as threatening as it was. Amara moved before his hand reached her. Not away, sideways and down, into the wreckage. She crouched among the ruined timber and scattered produce and began searching with both hands, moving a piece of broken wood, lifting the corner of what had been her stall's side panel. The crowd watched in silence. Julian stood above her, his extended hand now hanging slightly foolishly in the air, his narrative of the scene disrupted by this unexpected stage direction. She found what she was looking for. It was a crumpled delivery receipt, pale yellow, printed in blue ink on thin paper, the kind that comes in triplicate books bought from market stationery stalls for a few hundred naira. It was slightly torn at one corner and had a streak of orange juice across its face. She turned it over. The back was clean, pale, blank. She reached into the pocket of her blouse. The stubby pencil was about 4 centimeters long, the kind that gets used down to nothing over months of careful use, the kind you keep when new pencils cost money. The crowd, which had been murmuring in a low register like a tide, went quiet. Amara wrote. Her hands were steady. This was the detail people would keep returning to in the days afterwards when the story had spread through the area like water through cracked ground, that her hands were steady. She wrote slowly, deliberately, pressing hard enough that the pencil didn't slide. She wrote 7 words. Then she stood up. She was much shorter than Julian. Her eyes were level with his collarbone, but the crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, did not see a small woman looking up at a large man. It saw something else, something harder to name, a transfer of weight, a shift in the fundamental gravity of the scene. She held the receipt out to him. Julian, to his credit, or perhaps simply out of the reflexive instinct of a man who was always in a negotiation, took it.
And the world stopped. Not the street. The street continued to be exactly itself. Engines and voices, and the distant sound of a radio playing Afrobeats from somewhere, the caw of a bird, the smell of frying akara drifting from a stall 200 meters away. The world of sensation and noise continued without interruption. But inside the body of Julian Vance, something stopped so completely that it registered in his face before his mind had finished processing what his eyes had delivered. His expression, which had been wearing the practiced confidence of a man who was never without a next move, collapsed all at once into something structurally different. Not grief, not yet. Something that precedes grief, recognition, and the particular horror that attaches to it when recognition comes too late. His hands shook. The receipt trembled between his fingers. He read the words again. "The son you buried still calls me mother." To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about Tobias. Tobias Reginald Vance, named after his grandfather, which was itself a gesture of continuity that Tobias had spent his short life trying to escape, was born when Julian was 24 years old. His mother, Celeste, had been Julian's girlfriend for 2 years and his wife for 11 months before they separated in the particular way of 2 people who should never have married, and both knew it from the beginning, but were too young, too proud, and too surrounded by people telling them they were a perfect match to admit it. Tobias was 3 when his parents' marriage ended. He was 7 when the legal arrangements were finalized and he began the shuttling life of wealthy divorce, his mother in London's Kensington, his father in a Knightsbridge flat that was all angles and glass and art chosen by a decorator. Both homes maintained to the pitch of expensive perfection, neither of them in any way a place a child might feel he could take off his shoes on the carpet. He was a sensitive boy. This is not a criticism. Sensitivity, properly supported, is a form of intelligence, but in the Vance orbit, sensitivity was a liability. Julian's world ran on certainty and aggression and the capacity to see other people primarily as pieces on a board. Tobias had none of these qualities. He felt things extravagantly. He cried at films. He couldn't sleep after arguments. He kept journals that he hid in the lining of suitcases and destroyed one by one when he was old enough to fear them being found. By the time Tobias was 15, he and Julian communicated primarily through lawyers, not literally, but in spirit. What conversation they had was adversarial. Every exchange a tiny negotiation between Julian's vision of what his son should be and Tobias's desperate resistance to being anyone other than himself. Julian wanted an heir in the specific transactional sense, a continuation, a vessel of the accumulated weight of Vance's ambition. Tobias wanted above all else to be left alone to be ordinary. He was not allowed to be ordinary. The argument that defined their final chapter happened the week after Tobias turned 19, home from his first term at the business school Julian had selected, chosen and paid for, and announced rather than suggested. The details of the argument have the quality of details from all such arguments. They are specific enough to have been real, but also universal enough to have happened in every house, on every street, in every city where fathers and sons misunderstand each other across the uncrossable distance of different needs. Julian said, "You will make something of yourself." Tobias said, "I am something." Julian said, "Not yet." Tobias left that night. He took a bag, not the expensive one, the old one, and he took his passport and the small amount of money he had saved from summer work he'd done without telling Julian because he'd known Julian would find some reason to prevent it. He took a photograph of his mother and nothing else of the Vance world. He surfaced months later in a city Julian had no connection to and no instinct for, Lagos, where a friend from university had family, where Tobias had arrived with $200 and a willingness to be no one for a while. For a while became longer. He got work teaching English at a community school on the outskirts of the city. He was paid almost nothing. He lived in a room above a hardware shop. He was, for the first time in his life, content in a way that frightened him by how simple it was. And he met Amara. She was running the fruit stall, same as always. He had stopped to buy oranges because he was broke enough that the cheapest calories mattered, and she had looked at this tall, thin man with his too careful English and his expensive shoes worn down to the sole, and she had given him 6 oranges when he'd paid for 4, without making anything of it. He came back the next day, and the day after. The friendship that developed between them had the particular quality of friendships that form across unlikely distances. It moved fast, as though both people recognized something they'd been short of and didn't want to waste time being cautious about it. He called her Mama Amara, not because she was his mother, she was not old enough to be, truly, and they both knew it, but because there was something in her that was maternal in the deepest sense, the sense that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the willingness to see a person completely and not flinch from what you see. For 2 years, this was his life. Small, warm, real. Then he got sick. The diagnosis came in the way bad news always comes, suddenly, though it had been building for months in a way that was obvious in retrospect. It was a blood disorder, rare enough that it took 3 doctors to identify it, aggressive enough that the timeline was not generous. In another life, in a life with the resources of Julian Vance behind it, it might have been manageable. There were treatments. They were expensive. Tobias did not contact his father. He had made a decision about that a long time before the illness, a decision whose terms he had tested against enough quiet evenings to know he meant it. He did not want Julian's money with Julian's conditions attached, which is the only way Julian's money had ever come. He did not want to be reclaimed. He did not want the Vance world to reach across the ocean and pull him back into its orbit, even at the cost of his life, especially at the cost of his life. Amara argued with him about this. It was one of the very few arguments they ever had, and she lost it, because Tobias could be immovable in the way that soft people sometimes are, not rigid, but rooted. She said, "Let me call someone. Let me make one call." "No," he said. "This is my life. I lived it the way I wanted. Let me go the same way." She sat with him through the worst of it. She rearranged the stall to spend more time inside. She learned which soups were easiest for him to keep down and made them every day. She told her stories, her own stories, the long, winding stories of her own life, which had been full of loss and reinvention and a resilience so matter-of-fact that it read less as courage than simply as the shape of her character. He made her laugh, which was the thing he asked for most and which she gave most freely. He died on a Tuesday. In the morning, before the heat built, in the small room above the hardware shop, with Amara's hand in his and the sounds of the waking street coming through the window, the motorcycles and the traders and the particular music of a Lagos morning beginning its infinite, raucous, magnificent work. He was 22 years old. He left behind almost nothing: a bag, a few books, the worn-down shoes, and $112 in a small envelope that he had pressed into Amara's hand the week before he died, with instructions she honored to the letter. He told her, "Keep it. Don't spend it. It's not money. It's something else. You'll know what to do with it when the time comes." She had kept it for 3 years. She had not spent a cent. It was the last thing she had of him.
Julian Vance read the receipt again. "The son you buried still calls me mother." The crowd around them had gone very quiet. Not a silence imposed by shock or respect, though there was some of that, but the silence of people who were watching something that existed at a frequency they could feel but not quite name. The kind of silence that settles when the world is in the middle of becoming something it wasn't before. Julian was a man who had moved through the world for decades behind a glass wall. The glass was so well made, so transparent that he barely knew it was there. It looked simply like the world. But it kept everything at the precise distance where it could be observed and assessed, but not actually felt. Business reversals, relationship failures, even Tobias's departure, all had reached him through the glass, arriving as facts rather than wounds. The 7 words on the receipt were not transmitted through glass. They arrived directly. And Julian Vance, for the first time in as long as he could remember, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, had no response prepared. He remembered the funeral. Or rather, he remembered the version of the funeral that he had allowed himself to have. Efficient, contained, held at the family's preferred church in South Kensington, attended by people who knew the Vance name. The coffin had been extraordinarily expensive. The flowers had been extraordinarily expensive. Julian had stood in the front in a dark suit and held his composure with the same discipline he brought to quarterly earnings calls, and if anyone had looked closely at his face, and almost no one had, because almost no one looked closely at Julian Vance in any context, they might have seen something straining behind the composure, something that wanted to crack along a seam it didn't dare show. He had hired someone to find Tobias after he left. Of course he had. That was how Julian dealt with things, by hiring the appropriate professional. The investigator had tracked his son to Lagos, had filed reports, had even obtained photographs. Julian had looked at the photographs. His son, thin,
smiling at something out of frame, standing in front of what appeared to be a market stall, and had felt the familiar mixture of contempt and something that might have been longing, if longing were the kind of thing Julian Vance permitted himself. He had not gone to Lagos. He had told himself many things about why. He was busy. The time wasn't right. Tobias needed to come to his senses on his own timeline. Pursuing him would only confirm the dynamic Tobias objected to. Julian was a patient man. He could wait. He was always the one who could wait. He waited too long. The investigator had called him on a Thursday afternoon, voice careful with the particular care of professionals delivering facts they know will hurt. Tobias had died. He had died in Lagos. He had died, the investigator said, cared for by a local woman, a street vendor. Julian had been given a name. He had not sought her out. He had arranged to have his son's body returned to London. He had buried him. He had paid for a gravestone with an inscription he chose from a list provided by the stonemason. He had given no eulogy. He had gone back to work the following Monday, and he had worked every day since, with the particular intensity of a man who knows that if he stops, he will have to feel exactly what he has done to himself, and to his son, and to the space between them that was never filled while it could have been. Now he stood in the dust of Amara's wrecked stall in the third week of March, 48 years old, smelling of expensive cologne, and the paper in his shaking hands was the bill for everything he had refused to pay. There is a particular kind of reckoning that the world deals out to the rich. It is not poverty. It is not illness most of the time. It is not the ordinary reversals of fortune that most people endure in the ordinary course of lives built on ordinary foundations. The rich are insulated from most of those. What the world deals them eventually, if they have lived long enough and hard enough in the specific way that Julian Vance had lived, is a moment of perfect clarity. A moment in which every transaction and every compromise and every time they chose the easier cruelty over the harder kindness is laid out in front of them all at once, not as an accusation, but simply as a fact, as a balance sheet, as the thing they actually built with the raw material of their life. Julian Vance's moment of perfect clarity was standing in the wreckage of Amara's wrecked stall on a Tuesday morning in Lagos with a crumpled receipt in his hands and the smell of crushed fruit in the air. He looked at Amara. She was not looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, at the street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning resuming its business around them. A motorcyclist squeezing past the wreckage, a child chasing a bottle cap, a woman at a stall 20 meters away going back to arranging her goods, because life is always resuming, always refusing to pause for the weight of any single moment. The $112 in her pocket. Julian thought about that. 3 years. She had held those $112 for 3 years, unchanged, unspent, with the discipline of a devotion that didn't need to announce itself. Julian had wealth that generated that more in interest in the time it took him to finish a glass of wine, and he had not once in 3 years thought about the woman who had cared for his son, had not sent money, had not sent thanks, had not, if he was honest, and this was a species of honesty he was not accustomed to, even permitted himself to imagine that Tobias's final days were full of anything worth mourning in a human sense, rather than simply over in a logistical one. The woman with $112 had given his son everything Julian had refused to. She had given him home. She had given him warmth. She had given the irreplaceable dignity of being seen as a person rather than a project, of loved without conditions or agendas, without the invisible invoice that Julian attached to every gesture. She sat with him while he died and held his hand and been present in the way that Julian had never learned to be present for anyone, not even the people he claimed to care about. And she had kept his money. Not because she needed it, God knows she could have used it, not for sentiment in any soft sense, but because Tobias had said it was something else, and she had understood what he meant. It was proof. It was a thread, pulled thin over 3 years, connecting the small, warm room above the hardware shop to whatever came next, to whatever reckoning the world would eventually arrange. She had carried it, that thread, across 3 years of Tuesday mornings and market days and lonely evenings, and now she had used it. The thread had reached its other end. Julian's knees buckled. It was not a planned gesture. Julian Vance had never in his adult life gone to his knees for anything. His body simply stopped being able to hold the weight of what the last 90 seconds had delivered, and it made the only choice available when the structure gives. It went down. He knelt in the red dust, in his cream brioni suit among the splinters of Amara's stall and the crushed oranges and scattered receipts, with a $2 million car crumpled 20 feet away, and for the first time since his son was 19 years old, Julian Vance had no move to make, no play, no calculation, no next step prepared. The crowd was very quiet. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned away. She bent once more to the wreckage, and she retrieved 3 things: the plastic stool, which was undamaged, having been thrown clear; the leather-tattered purse, which had ended up at the base of a nearby concrete post and was intact; and the photograph of the young man laughing at something outside the frame, which had fallen from the purse and lay face up in the dust. Tobias's face looking up at the Lagos sky with an expression of uncomplicated joy. She put the photograph back in the purse. She put the purse over her shoulder. She picked up the stool with one hand, and she walked away. She walked away into the golden haze of a Tuesday morning in Lagos, unhurried, straight-backed, the faded indigo head wrap catching the light, moving with the particular dignity of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone because she has already done the most important thing, which was to show up, to remain, to give what she had to give and ask nothing in return, and then, when the time for accounts had come, to render it all in 7 words and walk away clean. The crowd parted for her, not dramatically, simply the way a crowd makes room for someone moving through it with intention. She didn't look back.
What happened after, the street would talk about for months. Julian Vance sat in the dust for a long time. No one who was there could agree on exactly how long. And it was long enough that 2 different people called the police and one called an ambulance before someone who recognized him from a business magazine calmed them down. He was not injured. He was not having a medical episode. He was simply sitting with something that had no quick resolution, and for the first time in his life, he was not trying to resolve it quickly. His phone rang 11 times while he sat there. He did not answer it. When he finally stood, he did not call his assistant. He did not arrange for the car to be towed, not immediately. He simply stood and looked at the wreckage, and then turned and began to walk in the direction Amara had gone, though she was long out of sight. He did not find her that day. He did find her 2 days later, through the kind of asking around that requires a complete absence of ego, going up to strangers, describing someone, accepting that they might not trust you, persisting anyway. She was at a new spot, not far from the old one, with a smaller arrangement of fruit balanced on a plastic crate because the stall was gone. He arrived with nothing impressive, no lawyers, no fixers, no assistant carrying a briefcase. He arrived in an ordinary car, a rented Toyota, the most ordinary thing available, in a shirt that was not brioni. He looked, for the first time since Amara had seen him, like someone she might talk to. He did not make speeches. He had spent 48 hours being extremely quiet on the inside, and in that silence, something had happened to the speech he'd prepared. It had dissolved, taken apart word by word, until what was left was not a speech at all, but a question. "Did he know?" Julian asked. "At the end, did he know I would have come if I'd known?" Amara looked at him for a while. "He knew you couldn't," she said. "He didn't blame you for what you were." It was a distinction Julian Vance would spend the rest of his life understanding, which was the exact right amount of time for it. He did not offer her money that day. He would not understand until much later how profoundly that would have missed the point. What he offered was something much harder for him to produce. He offered to listen. He asked her to tell him about Tobias, the real Tobias, the one who had lived here, not the sun-shaped absence he'd maintained in London. She told him. She told him for 2 hours, and Julian listened with the raw, undefended attention of a man who is receiving information he cannot afford to be numb to. He learned things about his son that made him laugh, and things that made him close his eyes. He learned that his son had been funny, genuinely, naturally funny, with a precise sense of timing that came, Amara said, looking at Julian thoughtfully, probably from you, whether you know it or not. He learned that his son had kept one photograph of Julian, not a posed one, not a magazine one, but a candid one someone had taken at a business event where Julian was mid-laugh about something, unguarded, surprisingly human. That Tobias had kept it, but never displayed it, and that the keeping of it said more than the not displaying. He wanted you to be a different person than you were, Amara told Julian, with the directness of someone who has decided she has nothing to lose from truth. But he loved the person you were anyway. Both things at once. That's what children do. Julian drove back to his hotel and sat on the balcony overlooking the Lagos Lagoon for the rest of the evening. He did not review any projections. He did not answer any calls. He watched the water go from afternoon silver to evening gold to the deep blue-black of a tropical night, and he let something happen inside him that he had been preventing for 48 years, which was simply this. He felt things without immediately moving to contain them. The telecoms deal he had come to assess, the one that had brought him to Lagos, that had resulted in the rented Pagani, that had put him on the side road at 8:43 on a Tuesday morning, he withdrew from. His advisors were confused. The deal was structured well, the numbers were sound. There was no visible reason for the withdrawal. Julian's reason was invisible to people who hadn't been on that street. He did not become a saint. Let's be clear about this, because the world is not a fable, and people do not remake themselves completely in 2 days, not even when they should. Julian Vance remained a complicated man, remained someone whose instincts were competitive and whose patience was limited, and who would always, at some level, be most comfortable when he was in control of something. These things don't dissolve. They are part of the architecture. But architecture can be renovated. He established a foundation, not the kind rich people establish to see their name on a building, the other kind, the kind that does unglamorous, structural work without much visibility. He worked with health systems in cities where young people were dying of things that were treatable if they could be reached in time. He funded community health workers. He hired people whose only job was to find the Tobias-shaped gaps in a city and fill them with money and presence and the willingness to remain. He returned to Lagos twice a year. He always stopped at Amara's stall. She had rebuilt it, not with his money, though he had offered and she had declined and he had understood, but with her own. It looked different from the old one, more permanent. Someone had painted the wooden frame a deep yellow-green that stood out in the morning light like something deliberately chosen, which it was. She always had oranges. He always bought 4 and received 6. He never asked about the $112. He knew what it was. It was the record of a debt that couldn't be paid in any currency he had access to, only acknowledged, only honored by the way you lived afterward. Amara kept it, still, in the tattered leather purse, folded flat. And every morning when she opened the stall and arranged the fruit and tilted the zinc roof to the angle that caught the best light, she touched the purse once, not to check what was inside, she knew exactly what was inside, but the way you touch something that matters, the way you keep a thing alive. They say money talks, but stand at Amara's stall on a Tuesday morning and listen to the city waking up, the motorcycles and the vendors and the children and the birds and the smell of something frying somewhere nearby. And what you hear is not money. What you hear is everything money cannot be. A woman with $112 broke a man worth billions.
Not with anger, not with accusation, not with a lawsuit or a demand or a demonstration. With 7 words written on the back of a flower receipt with a 4-centimeter pencil in hands that were steady in the morning light of a city that was large enough to contain every kind of human story simultaneously. The collision of 2 worlds. The car was repaired. The stall was rebuilt. The fruit was restacked. But some things, once shattered, don't go back together the same way. Some things, when they shatter, become something more. That is the thing about truth. You can build a life inside the lie. You can maintain it, furnish it, drive a $2 million car through it. But somewhere in the city, on a Tuesday morning, there is always a woman counting 7 words and waiting for the moment to be exact. She destroyed his car. Her words destroyed his soul. And in the end, the woman with nothing gave the man with everything exactly what he deserved: the truth.